Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us in part 2 of Hutchinson Black and Cook's panel series discussing the systematic patterns of racial segregation and exclusion in our community. For those of you who are unable to join us for our first panel, this is part of Hutchinson Black and Cook's multi-pronged anti-racism initiative commenced last year after the murder of George Floyd. Our first panel, addressing the Black community in Boulder and beyond, is available for streaming. A link will be circulated early next week, along with a link to tonight's panel. For the lawyers in the audience, a link to the CLE credit form will appear in the chat during the course of tonight's panel. I hope everyone was available to log in early this evening. Thanks in particular to Stephen Halsey-Williams for his music. Stephen is a self-described intertribal urban native. He is also a member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. He grew up here in Boulder, and his work, which includes everything from the standalone Native American flute pieces like what we were just enjoying, to a self-produced metal album featuring that instrument, are available on his bandcamp.com page, a link to which will also be circulated. Tonight, we will be addressing the impact of internalized racism, both historically and today, and in particular, how that has affected the Native American community, as well as the resilience of those communities and the very powerful pushback they have raised against systematic erasure. We have a phenomenal panel of speakers tonight, each of whom offers a very distinct area of expertise on these topics. While we're sorry that due to current health concerns, you, the audience, are unable to join us in person tonight, we are thrilled that so many of you have logged on to join us remotely. Special thanks to all of our co-sponsors, the Native American Rights Fund, blackpast.org, the CU Native American Law Students Association and Black Law Students Association, the Center for the American West, and of course, the CU Law School. Before I introduce tonight's moderator, I'd like to take a moment to remind everyone in the audience, wherever you're logging in from, you, in your homes, in your living rooms, in your offices, in your cars, you are standing on Indian land. Understanding this is fundamental to the conversation that you are about to witness, and to the steps that we will all be asked to take in order to recognize and dismantle these grossly unfair systems that have been faced by the Native American communities. Now, it is my distinct honor to turn the floor over to our moderator, Patrice Kunesh. Of Standing Rock Lakota descent, Patrice began her legal career at the Native American Rights Fund here in Boulder. She's recently returned to NARF, this time serving on their development team. Patrice has decades of public service expertise. She's held numerous positions and appointments at the tribal, state, and federal level. She is the founder and director of Pehin Haha Consulting, a social enterprise committed to building an engaged and powerful Native American community through targeted and culturally appropriate economic development. Patrice.
Thank you so much. In the language of my Lakota relatives, good evening, everyone, and come in together with a good heart. After many months of planning and anticipation, I am so happy to be here tonight with this highly esteemed panelist and a terrific conversation. I'm immeasurably grateful to Lucy Walker for her tremendous enthusiasm for this panel and for Hutchinson Black and Cook's sponsorship of these important community conversations. My hope is that this panel will be a platform for better understanding Native American history and to use it for healing and social justice for ourselves and our communities. And speaking of justice, it is my enormous privilege to introduce a modern day warrior for Native justice, my boss, John Echohawk. For over 5 decades, John has battled justice for Native tribes across the country. A citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma, John has been a leading member of the Native Self-Determination Movement and helped to establish the Native American Rights Fund in 1970. NARF is a landmark in Boulder. Our attorneys are among the foremost litigators in matters of tribal sovereignty and safeguarding Native lifeways and resources. John himself is a legacy and has been recognized as one of the 100 most influential lawyers by the National Law Journal. We are so pleased to have John help set the context for our discussions this evening. John?
Thank you, Patrice. I'm very pleased to be here this evening and help kick off this panel about Native Americans today. It's really important because so many people don't really know anything about us, and that's, when you come down to it, our biggest problem, and that's one of the issues that we address here at the Native American Rights Fund. Most people don't even know that our organization is here in Boulder. We're one of the best kept secrets, I always say. But we are here because when we organized back in 1970 as the National Indian Legal Defense Fund to provide legal representation to our people who were the poorest of the poor, had no money for lawyers, but had treaty rights under federal law that were totally being ignored. And so we organized, started raising money, hiring lawyers, making them available to represent our tribes across the country and bring these treaty rights issues to the courts. And the courts recognize that the treaties are not ancient history. They are the supreme law of the land. And we started enforcing them, and it changed everything. Tribal sovereignty. Tribes are governments, and we're part of the American system of government. There's the federal government, the state governments, and the tribal governments. And that has come into being here over the last 51 years since we started. We're located here in Boulder because most of the tribes in this country are located west of the Mississippi River. And as I said, our people were the poorest of the poor. They didn't have money to come visit us. We had to go see them. And so we picked a central western location for our office, and Colorado's right in the middle of the West. And we had to choose between locating in Denver or locating here in Boulder, because one of the first grants we got had to be run through a law school. So we talked to the people at the Denver Law School and the Colorado Law School here. And the law schools really didn't know anything about this, but it looked like CU Law School was more interested in what we were doing than maybe DU. Plus, Boulder is a much nicer place to live, in my view, than Denver. So we chose Boulder. So here we are. We've been here 50 years, and we've come to be known as one of the leading national Native American organizations in the country. We've got 12 of our lawyers located here. We've got 3 in our Washington, D.C. office, and 5 up in Anchorage, Alaska. Alaska's a long way away, and it's better to serve them with their own office up there. So we've got 20 lawyers, about 70 or 80 cases going on all across the country at any given time. And of course, our major focus is when these cases get to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the tribes rely on us to coordinate the litigation that gets up there. And so that's one of our major projects, the Tribal Supreme Court project. We have been governed all these years by a national board of Native American leaders. They know what's going on all around the country. They know that there's no way for us to represent everybody, all the tribes, Native organizations, individuals that come to us with important Indian rights issues. So they prioritize these issues. And the most important issue we address, preserving tribal existence. That's that tribal sovereignty I was talking about under the treaties. Second of all, protecting our homelands, our lands, our natural resources, our water rights. That's really important as well. Third, our rights just as human beings. We have our own cultures, religions. We have a right to vote just like everybody else. That's a huge issue we're involved in right now across the country. as there's many states who are trying to suppress the Native vote. And so we're very, very involved in that and the legislation pending in Congress right now. We also hold the federal government accountable to the treaties and, all the federal laws benefiting Indians. And finally, like I said, we spend a lot of time educating the public about federal Indian law and policy because so many people don't know about that. That includes presidents, senators, congressmen, cabinet officials, judges. So we're always out there telling everybody about federal Indian law and policy. We really appreciate every opportunity to educate the public about ourselves, and the panel here this evening is really going to be able to do that here in terms of what's happening here in Colorado on these issues. And so, again, I'm really glad to have Patrice participating in this and organizing this, working with everyone here in Colorado on these issues. So again, I'm glad you could all join here this evening and enjoy the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate your instructive and compelling words. Very good. So now it's my honor to introduce our three panelists who have really graciously given their time and will be sharing their experience and their wealth of knowledge with us this evening. On my right is Ava Hamilton, and Ava is a historian. She's also a filmmaker, and she's based here in Boulder. An Arapaho Indigenous woman, Ava brings a deep personal experience to her examination of local history. Her film, Everything Has a Spirit, premiered at the Sundance in 1994, and it's won numerous accolades. Ava also has held the position of president of the Native American Producers Association. Grace Redshirt Tyan, on my far right, Grace is Lakota, Oglala Lakota, and serves as the director of American Indian Student Services at CU Denver. She is a passionate community organizer and an advocate for Native youth in the area. And to my left is Rick Waters, a citizen of the Kiowa and Cherokee tribes of Oklahoma. Rick is the co-executive director of the Denver Indian Center. Rick has more than 40 years experience working in Indian country, particularly in Indian education at both the American Indian College Fund and CU University of Colorado here in Boulder. And he's also chaired the American Indian Advisory Group and helped with the renaming of White Antelope Hall, which I hope we're going to hear about later today. He also was the founding member of the CU American Indian Alumni Association. I also want to give special recognition to Rick Williams, who assisted us in developing this panel discussion, but he was not able to be with us this evening. So now for the discussion. I want to premise this as well to say that this has been a phenomenal year for Boulder and the state of Colorado, not just because of the continuing COVID crisis, but because of the racial reckoning happening in the State House and in our local communities. In case you missed it, Colorado Governor Polis revoked the 1864 still in effect proclamation that urged all citizens of Colorado to, quote, kill and destroy Native people. This proclamation legalized genocide, was used to incite murders, and the Sand Creek Massacre was the result of this dreadful action. Mind you, that order was in effect for 157 years. And when Governor Polis signed the executive order, he said this: "We can't change the past, but we can honor the memories of those we lost by recognizing their sacrifice and to do better." In addition, the Colorado legislature passed two major bills this year. One bans the use of offensive Native imagery and names in Colorado schools, ending decades of debates on these issues. The other requires public universities to offer in-state tuition classification to students who are members of tribes with historic ties to Colorado. Two of these institutions, Colorado State University and Fort Lewis College, are making significant changes as well. Before St. Louis became an institution of higher education, it was the Teller Indian School, a boarding school for Native children. Opened in 1866, the Teller Indian School was one of the 350 federally run schools across the country to assimilate Native children. Tens of thousands of Native children were removed from their families, suffered terrible trauma at those schools, which has carried forward in each generation. Many children died at the Teller Indian School, and efforts today are underway to recover their remains and return them to their families. At CSU, the Board of Governors are moving ahead in a land deal involving the Hughes Stadium land. While the exact future use of the land has not been determined, the city of Fort Collins has promised to include the Native American community in future discussions about the land. The Intertribal Alliance for the Hughes Land Back has asked CSU to return those unceded treaty lands to Native stewardship, or at the very least, to respect the spirit of the lands once used by the Utes, Lakota, Arapaho, Cheyenne, and other Native tribes. And in nearby Denver, the Denver Public Library has decided to rename the Byers Library branch after learning that William Byers, the namesake of the library, contributed to the Sand Creek Massacre. The renaming committee has made a formal recommendation to rename the library Thunderbird Man Branch in honor of our good friend John M. Hula Jr., a revered Kiowa elder. So we've got a lot to talk about, and the first question that I'd like to ask our panelists is this. This is significant progress, to be sure. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, is this enough? And why is it happening now? Did they go far enough? So Rick, I think I'm going to turn to you first and ask your thoughts. Did it go far enough?
I'll respond by saying, number one, we can do better. We, as all of us, I think the shared exchange of information and history, which relates to education, understanding who we are, number one, as a people, but I think the key is something I take from what John F. Kennedy stated in 1963. He said, American Indians are the most misunderstood and least understood Americans in the United States. And it would behoove everybody to study and learn about American Indians and the history here in the United States. And if that doesn't happen, I'm paraphrasing, the legacy of the United States treatment towards American Indians will continue to be a travesty. And that was, 50, 60 years ago. And we haven't made a whole lot of progress, but we have made progress. And we want to address that. I'm one of those people that kind of sticks to the positive side in pointing things out. So I'll respond to that. But I want to keep it simple right now, but we can do better. Things have happened. The legislation, we live in a state that's very progressive. Things are happening right now in terms of planning and strategy to even bring more legislation that will impact our community.
Thank you. Gracie, I'd like to ask you, why do you think this is happening now? What's the undercurrents that has bubbled up to actually make 2021 the year of this pretty significant legislation and executive order from our governor?
Well, I think you stated it in the beginning, Patrice, because of the murder of George Floyd. And all across the country and the world, people saw that on cell phones. So we're seeing how people of color are being treated. and being murdered out in public by the police. And so I think that was a catalyst for what's happening now. And, you talked about, legislation and, the bills that have been passed, and those are small victories, and those are wonderful. But those are made because of people, because people get out into the streets and people make these changes. The frontline people that get out there with their signs and their fight and all of that, they're the ones that really push for this change. And I think that the young people today, you mentioned in my introduction how, I work with young people. I work with college students and high school students and on down. They have a fire and they want to see change. They're concerned. They are concerned about their world. They're concerned about climate justice. They're concerned about equity. They're concerned about healthcare. They're concerned about the cops killing our people. So I think it goes back to that, and again, I think that, this work is amazing work that's being done with the in-state tuition. That happened because of students at CU Denver. They had a meeting with the regents, with the Board of Regents at CU Denver, and who passed a resolution, who then took it forward to the state legislation. And this work, was started years ago. We've had allies in the state representatives, Joe, I can't remember his last name right now, but he took this bill up several years ago, and it died. But the time is right now. So we're gonna see a lot more changes coming, and I think it's because of the people on the front lines and the young people.
Wow, thank you. Ava, as an Arapaho Indigenous woman, how did the executive order from Governor Paulus strike you? Maybe I should step back. I mean, did you know that this proclamation was still on the books, still effective? Did you know that that was still a thing in your lifetime?
Well, I was aware that there was something like that because I had heard that it was illegal for us to be here.
Oh.
Indigenous people, Indian people. And so when Rick Williams started to research it, he reached out to me and told me what he was working on. And that's the first I knew about the law. So it applied today, it applied to all of the citizens, the indigenous peoples here, to know this part of history. And we were all really disturbed that it was still on the books, even though it was explained to us that it was really not, it didn't have any regulations.
Any force.
Yeah, a voice. So, but it did. It was an example of how we were treated and how our very important old people who love this land, who love this world, were treated, and killed. Sand Creek Massacre. I mean, my relatives were the ones who lived right here in Boulder. I'm very attached to Boulder. I love this place because of the history that my ancestors came here as they were nomadic peoples of Algonquin dialects. The Arapaho people chose this place. It wasn't, they weren't put here by the government. They decided that this is where they wanted to be. So as a historian, to learn more about this place is really important to me, and to know that its name was really special to me, because it's not Boulder, it's like the place, and I can't say it in Arapaho, I'm not fluent by any means, but they call this place the place where it's steep, the Flatirons. And they said that's not its name, that's what they saw, that's what the Arapaho people saw when they first came here. They saw the Flatirons, the place where it's steep. And because for years I would ask, well, what is the name of this place where I live? where Boulder is, and they'd say, it's home. They would just call every place home. There was no name place for where we lived. It was all home. So I was happy to hear that. It was part of the research I did when the city of Boulder decided to have Indigenous Peoples Day in the first Monday of every October, which we just celebrated. And Boulder has never celebrated Columbus Day. And part of the resolutions that came out of that committee, Human Rights Committee that I participated in was that we would encourage all academic institutions to include the teaching of Indian history in American history, which really it doesn't include us. We are pretty invisible, and yet what I like to tell people is that we have been here for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and our history doesn't begin with 1492. And wherever we live on Turtle Island, on Mother Earth here, that we are at home, because this is where we come from. And I think Rick Cattell has more numbers about how many different tribes are represented here in Denver, and I think it's over like 250. And we come from everywhere, but we are not strangers to this land, to this place. We all live here and we all call this home. We didn't come from somewhere else. So I'm still learning. Some of the things I learned was that this front range of the Rocky Mountains was a migration trail for one of the Hopi clans. So, that's not taught in American history. And the other was that in right around the about 1500s, right when the ships landed on our coast out there on the East Coast, that there was Aztec presence here in Colorado, and I've heard that there was Aztec presence in Wyoming around the same time. So our people walked everywhere. There was indigenous peoples from the Arctic to the bottom of South America and Argentina and coast to coast. There was not a place that was not lived on by our people, our relatives. So we want that to be included in American history and the teaching, and we want everyone to know everything about each other, and that we are related to this earth. And we're starting to hear that from indigenous knowledges that we are the protectors and the lovers of all human life, all life. So there's a lot of change going on, and living in Boulder is, even though there's very few indigenous peoples here anymore, there's a lot of allies and a lot of water protectors. The watershed people are concerned about the water that we are drinking here in Boulder and wanting to protect it. And I love that community. I love that Boulder community who are reaching out to not only indigenous people, but to each other. This is how we're gonna survive and to exist that in the future. But I'm getting carried away with everything that I do. There's a lot going on.
This is fascinating,
Yeah.
Ava. Thank you so much. And I love the concept, the notion that Boulder is home. And in Lakota, we say Unchimaka, Mother Earth. So all of you have had some extensive experience in the field of education. Some of you are currently very much associated and involved with education institutions. Ava spoke a little bit about her education experience here, But I'm just curious, how did you learn about Native American history and culture? Grace, I think I'll start with you. You did not grow up here, is that correct?
I grew up here actually, and in South Dakota.
Yeah.
So I grew up in both places. And growing up, I learned about basically who I was as a Lakota girl, a Lakota child, because of my family. I always knew that. And I was brought up in a household where intergenerational home with uncles and aunties and grandmas and grandpas and many older siblings. And so that was, it was always present, and Lakota language was spoken in my home. And when I did go to school, though I started school in Denver public school system, and of course there was nothing that was taught there about who I was, anything about me as an Indigenous child. I learned what everybody learns. I learned about Columbus coming here in 1492 and discovering us. And I learned about, you know, George Washington and all the presidents. And I didn't learn about the Haudenosaunee. And I didn't learn that that's where the United States copied the formula for democracy of this country. I didn't learn about those things until I was a student in college. And I took classes like Indigenous Political Systems from Professor Glenn Morris. And that's where I learned those things. Some of the things I did learn about my history as a Lakota person, as a Lakota child, I remember when I was in junior high school, my mom got me the book called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And I read that book. And I learned so much about the history of our people that no one was teaching that book in school. And so, you know, coming from a household, a pretty traditional household, but in a colonized and invader state, you know, there's a balance. So you go to school and you learn all these things about, you know, the history of America. And we don't learn about the history of who we are. But I was also raised by a boarding school survivor. My mom was sent off to boarding school, not sent, but basically taken. And she graduated from a government boarding school back in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. And so she didn't learn any of this type of history at that school either. She learned how to be a really good seamstress. She learned how to bake bread really well. She learned how to read. She learned how to write. And all my aunties did. And my couple of my grandmothers. In my family, my grandpa did not ever go to school. He didn't go to the white man's school. So he had education from traditional ways. He was a hunter, and he was, you know, he knew how to farm, and he knew how to grow all the food that the family needed. And so, you know, those are the things that were lost. So many things that our people lost because of the invasion, because of colonization, because of the lack of, you know, telling the history, sharing our history, sharing the history of this land, the true history of this land. So yeah, I think I'm kind of rambling on, but I have so much to say about that, but, you know, I'll let Rick have a chance.
I'm captivated. I want to go on to, so Rick, are you from Colorado, or did you migrate as well?
My ancestors were from Colorado, and I always point this out. The Kai was welcomed the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and the Lakota when they came here. We were migratory. We actually came from the far north. Our history, and down from Canada into Montana, the Badlands, into Colorado. And I've heard stories of grandparents talking about their grandparents or their grandparents being born at the foot of the Rockies during this travel and migration, and ultimately into Texas and Oklahoma. But I grew up in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma, as you know, is formerly known as Indian Territory, 39 tribes. The majority of them were forcibly placed on reservation or Indian country land in Oklahoma. I'm half Kiowa and half Cherokee, so the Kiowas, again, I'll say, you know, Oklahoma is a traditional homeland for us. Cherokees, through the Trail of Tears, were brought in. So learning about who I was as a Kiowa or Cherokee, that's what my grandparents told me growing up. That's what my dad told me growing up. Secondarily, as a group, I was an Indian. And Native American was a term that came about, I think, later, but is acknowledged and accepted right now. But what I would probably point out, I guess, in terms of what I remember growing up and what I was told, I was in a family that moved. My dad was a Methodist minister, so he moved around to different locations in Oklahoma. In each one of these locations, there was a different tribe that lived in that community. So I grew up knowing how to sing church hymns in Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Kiowa. You know, I didn't know the language, but I knew the meanings of songs. But I went to schools primarily non-Indians attending, and I was many times the only Indian kid in the class. But because I had parents that were, and grandparents that were very positive about who we were. On the Kiowa side, my grandfather was one of the bundle keepers, the 10 grandmothers. Kiowas are Sundance people, and that was part of our old religion. So I learned that just by observing as a kid. I remember, and my wife and I talk about that, remember evenings staying with our grandparents, our Kiowa grandparents, and having people come visit to talk. And the whole evening would be in conversation in Kiowa. Mm-hmm. The same held true with when I visited my Cherokee relatives. You know, I didn't know what they were saying, but I knew when they were talking about me. It's hard to, you know, when you have a mother that speaks Kiowa and a dad that speaks Cherokee, you know, and they get along with smoke signals, it's kind of hard to pick that up. But I did grow up fortunate, and I was blessed, I think, with some athletic talent, and that's what kind of gave me a little bit of advantage. And I share that sometimes with my experience with education, because I remember thinking, even though I grew up in Norman, Oklahoma, or the University of Oklahoma, you know, right there on a campus, I didn't know what a university really was about. And even into my high school years, I thought going to college was far away from home, because I remember we took my uncle to Haskell, drove him to Haskell. And that's what I thought college was all about, because they said, we're taking him to college. Mm-hmm. So, you know, kind of like Gracie was saying, you know, these memories start coming up, and I start remembering what it was like. But the main thing is, and what I, in working with young people, try to instill in them, is that to be proud and positive of who they are and where they came from, and that education of learning from their family, or even reading. So, you know, one thing, and I'll share it and I'll stop, because it's kind of around a lot of attorneys and legal people here. Growing up in Oklahoma, 39 tribes, but as a small child, I was always told there are only one reservation in Oklahoma. That was the Osage Reservation. Uh-huh. All others were Indian country or Indian land, even though, you know, that was territory. But the McGirt decision recently, now the Creek Nation is recognized as a reservation. From my understanding, I may be wrong again, you know, things change. I know they're challenging it in state court and such.
John Echohawk mentioned this in his opening comments about the treaties, or the supreme laws of the land. And the opening line of the McGirt decision, written by Justice Gorsuch, Colorado, he comes from the Colorado justice system. I think it goes something like this: at the end of the Trail of Tears, there was a promise. And that promise is to be fulfilled. And the promise was that it was going to be the homeland for the Native people there. And the decision ultimately, as you said, Rick, upheld the reservation in Oklahoma. Something else you said, Rick, you said what the university was all about. And here's an experience I had attending CU Law School a couple decades ago. And this, I think, several of you have experienced as well. As a law student, there were several students on campus who were really riled up about the names of the student dormitories. And this was Sheridan Hall or Nichols Hall. And around that time, this awareness was just growing and growing. And then all of a sudden, the university agreed to change the names of those dormitories. And my education through those student organizers and activists, informed me that both Sheridan and Nichols were military leaders in the Sand Creek Massacre. And it was just a cognitive shift, to realize that the university had named these buildings housing our young people who were being educated here after military leaders who were, bound to kill us. And Gracie, I think you were involved in making some of those changes. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Well, I wasn't involved directly, but my sister-in-law, Norma Rendon, really led that charge. She was a student here at that time. And yeah, she was a student leader and an activist at that time. And really, sometimes she'd be the only student sitting out there with her sign. And there's pictures of her like that. And I know that many other students eventually got involved, and that's how change happens a lot of times, though, is with students. And I think it's important what you said also, Patrice, about, they were military leaders, but they were also Indian killers. Mm-hmm. And I think language is really, really important and really powerful. Let's call it what it is, because they were leading the military of the United States government, but they were Indian killers. They were sent to kill us and kill our people. And I think it's one of the things that students, they work on sometimes when they get aware. Rick talked about identity strength and how his grandparents really instilled that strong identity of him as a Kiowa and Cherokee man. And the same thing, happened with me. It was a really strong instillment of who I was as a Lakota person. And I think that's what students learn. They're not only learning in their classes at college, but they're learning who they are as people. And so, there's a strong movement to dismantle the worldviews of colonization. And not only the worldviews, but everything like statues and even vocabulary. So I think that, back to the changing of the name, Rick was a part of that also. Rick was here during that time.
Mm-hmm. I know Rick was, and then White Antelope Hall. How did that come about?
Well, the same thing. And Norma, I'm glad you was thinking about when you mentioned her name. It was an effort. It was a process. And at that time, the president of the university, Gordon Gee, I believe was Gordon Gee, and the key ally that we had on campus was the chancellor, James Corbridge.
Oh, yes.
And, we saw what we thought were injustices, and some of the kids, expressed, they said, well, I feel uncomfortable living in a place that, was named after a murderer, so to speak. And so that got a lot of impetus and picked up steam. And I remember actually going and visiting with regents of the University of Colorado over dinner, just explaining to them the concern and why these students and why our community were offended by the name. And so it was a lobbying. We did the process. You know, we didn't try to strong arm, the system. We actually used, books and logic and argument, used their own weapons against them, so to speak. And Ben Nighthorse Campbell was involved in it as well. But again, Rick Williams, you mentioned him, and the students, we were all very much active in trying to bring that about and the change. So it was a celebration when we got the
Yes,
name
it was a
change.
celebration, and thank you, Rick and Norma and all the students. Ava, I wanted to ask you about this. What are your thoughts about how we more accurately teach our students about Native American history and culture? You know, we talked about our own education of how we learned about our Indian identities and being in the world. But obviously here at a university, it's incredibly important that we that we get it right? And we think about the in-state tuition. Does that strike you as a game changer? Will more students be interested in attending schools in Colorado? Does Colorado have a special place in terms of how we can more holistically share the history, culture, and knowledge of Native Americans?
I'll comment on that, but I wanted to comment on those dorm names and
Oh, yes, please.
why I came to Colorado in the first place was to be a student here at CU under the educational opportunity programs, which were all across the country. And I had gone to school the summer before in way long time ago, in 1968. We had this summer program, and we traveled by bus, all these Native American students from all across the country. We marched with Jesse Jackson in Operation Breadbasket, and we met with Muhammad Ali. We got to meet him. We visited the different cultural centers there in Chicago and stayed in Lincoln Park. And we had a really good educational experience, and we began to learn about the political history of our people, which is really important because it involves treaties and federal Indian law and the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery really came into my world recently, and this is not taught in public school. I think everybody should learn about the doctrine of discovery because it led to the two justice systems in this country, federal Indian law, which is, treaty law and other laws that came after regarding the rights of indigenous peoples on their lands, and then federal law, which is everyone, including the federal Indian law. But at that time in the 60s, we were students all across the country, and when I came here to school, there was a student here by the name of Tim Cloberdance, who was trying to change, I can't remember the name of the dorm, to White Antelope Hall. And it was the first time I was really aware of the Sand Creek Massacre. And this was my own relatives who were there and who had lived here in Boulder and who were massacred there at Sand Creek. I didn't learn about it. It wasn't talked about at my community, even though now I hear people saying, well, my grandfather told me this, or my dad. Well, we didn't talk about it. I was like Gracie said, our public education was, Columbus discovered America. And at Thanksgiving time, we would have plays, and I would always be an Indian. I didn't know I was an Indian. And then the white kids would be the Pilgrims. I knew I was Arapaho. So that kind of, I call it Hollywood interpretation of the history of this country really needs to change. But I began to learn that as a student. And we advocated for change too. We advocated for that, the change of the dorm name to White Antelope Hall. And I began to learn that White Antelope was the first person who was killed at the Sand Creek Massacre. And I know relatives of White Antelope today. We're still here. We still know who we are. But we were really cut off by historic events like Sand Creek Massacre, which killed off our knowledge holders, our people who had responsibility, and our history. Any forward transference of knowledge was severely interfered with by the Sand Creek Massacre. And after that, the policies, the genocide policies of trying to kill, take the Indian out of the man and just boarding schools, you name it, really interfered with our knowledges of, like for instance, all of our knowledges about the place names in Colorado, which is, it's an ongoing project, and I really like that too. But it seems like students are really leaders in change, being change agents of our, and recognition of our histories and how we can reclaim things that we should have today, like land. And that's one of the things that I ask for. And it's due to allies. I do a lot of speaking here in this area and around Boulder and Fort Collins and other places on Arapaho history and history. And when people from the audience ask me, what can we do? How can I help? And my request has always been for land. And it's so that we who live here, we urban people, urban Indians who live here, can have a relationship to land and have privacy and do things together. We have the Denver Indian Center, and we have another place that's called Tall Bull Park. But it's not, it's real difficult. It's real hilly, and it's not used as much as it should be. But I'd like to have some land up here in the mountains where I know there was a lot of, for thousands of years, we don't even know who those people were. We don't know their names of the tribes, but we know that they lived here. There's history for thousands of years that they find. I think up at Estes Park, they found some pottery up there. So it's been, when land recognition says only 3 tribes, Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute, it makes me sad because it's not recognizing all of the people who have lived here previously, and there were many. So if we recognize all the people who lived here, it would include people from today. It would include all the people that Creator put here and who now live here. And maybe we can have a closer relationship, not just Indigenous people, because we all live here now. And those are some of my allies. And that's sort of some of the work that I try to do, is to be a good neighbor and an advocate for love of life, which is love of Mother Earth, so that we can all be here in the future and not just focusing on Indigenous peoples. I still do that because that's who I am, and that's who I advocate for and I'm a part of. But for all humanity, we're all, I think I got this from the Lakota people, we're all related.
You're all related.
All life is related, and we need to know that, so that we can be here in the future.
Lakota, Mitakuapi, we are all related, my relatives. I love what you said. I just found it really powerful. I didn't know I was an Indian, but I knew I was Arapaho. You know, that's really, really powerful. One of the folks in the audience, our virtual audience, has asked a question, and the question is sort of what we're talking about. But he's asked, or this person has asked us to comment on how the fervor over critical race theory impacts the ability to accurately tell the story of Indigenous people. Critical race theory to me is very much everything we say is a critique about our place in this world and how we got to be where we are today, both education and spiritually and culturally. I don't think it is a theory as much as a way we practice our lives, but Grace, do you see an application of critical race theory in this discussion or in this work?
I do, and I agree with what you said too, Patrice. I mean, our people have always been critical thinkers. I mean, our people are, you know, our elders are historically architects, scientists, engineers, I mean, astrologers, astronomers, and all of that. And so I think we've always thought critically and always been able to, in our history, our people have always been able to live in balance. We're the only people that have lived sustainably and didn't take more than what we needed. I mean, there's like, you know, all these articles coming out about what the Indigenous people have known for thousands of years. And I always say that, you know, Western science and the Western world is just now catching up to what our ancestors knew and the teachings that we still carry. Some have been lost, but some we still hold on to. We still have some of the knowledge keepers. And I really appreciate what Ava was talking about. And, you know, I didn't mention this in the beginning, but, you know, I'm really honored to be on this panel with both Ava and Rick and also with John, who has left earlier and been a part of this community. And Ava watched me grow up. Ava had a really close relationship with my mother. And our communities are very tight-knit. And so we know each other's families and things like that. But critical race theory is nothing new to us. It's one of those things, again, where, you know, Western science is just now catching up to us. I believe that our people have always thought critically. And just like you stated, Patrice, you know, the spiritual and the mental and the physical and the emotional, all of those things encompass the way that we think and the way that we carry ourselves as Indigenous people. But there is a lot of fervor about it. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people who do not want it to be taught to their children, and they are fighting school districts to, you know, take it out of the curriculum. And I've heard that they're calling it revisionist history, which, you know, has nothing to do with that. It's actually beneficial for students to learn to think critically. So that's my take on it.
How about you, Rick? Do you see an application? Does critical race theory even apply in this context?
I'm glad the person that's listening in, you know, asked that question, because I agree with Gracie as well. When you think about the mascot issue,
Yes,
and you think about all the issues that we are trying to bring to light, people don't understand. And, you know, you've heard the truth will set you free, but truth is hard for some people. And this gets political. It's geographic. You know, you're a product of your environment. And if you're taught one thing your whole life and your parents and grandparents thought one way, you're probably going to think that one way. And if you are not exposed to the truth or the real history, then you'll never understand American Indian issues and philosophy and things like that. I always say American Indian history is American history because it's all around land and acquisition of land. You know, you have something I want, I'm going to get it. Look at everything, the treaties to, you know, all the things that are tied to your question. And I try to simplify it because I talk to so many people, organizations and groups, and you can't, you know, put together a 1-month seminar to try to answer a question. And I tell them, basically, the government system of reservations, that happened. And it took away the way of life for many, if not all, the tribes, okay? The next step, if you want to call it termination or assimilation, the soft term for it, were the boarding schools. And both my parents attended boarding schools. My mom went from grade school all the way through high school, Chilocco in Oklahoma. My dad actually went to public school until junior high, and then he went to boarding school, Sequoia. And I don't know if we mentioned it earlier. I hope I don't get off on track. John Imahula, who I think you mentioned, the library in Denver was named after him, and that was actually confirmed today.
Oh my gosh.
So it will happen, and I believe November 13th will be the ceremony of the actual naming. But I only mention that because John Imahula also went to boarding school, but he takes credit, and he would always tell me, I introduced your mom and dad together way back when.
Wow.
But that being said, you know, Indian history is American history. And you have, you know, if you get the truth, and your question earlier, what did I learn growing up? A couple pages, you know, Trail of Tears, 1 page, talked about it, just movement, didn't explain, you know, all the death and all the tragedy that went along with it. In Oklahoma, you grow up, and my wife and I have been talking about this recently. The big thing is the Oklahoma land runs, where they basically just, you know, glamorized it. And you look, but literally that was taking lands, just setting up, you know, through unlawful treaties in some cases, or unscrupulous negotiators. But I think it all comes back to, if you don't understand the history of a people that are trying to tell you why we think the way we think because of our values and beliefs, then you're going to continue with what you've learned through movies, TVs, novels. And even if you think about it, a lot of our archaeology, or a lot of our history books, or a lot of our curriculum that's taught even on the college level, and you look at when they were written around the history of a lot of tribes, they were written by men archaeologists or men anthropologists. And they tell what they saw, and often it's a little distorted. Alice Marriott, who lived with the Kiowas for a while, you know, pointed out another point of view that was counter to that, saying, you know, women within the tribe actually had more power control. And I think now it's fine, all across many tribes are finding out. Again, you know, if I say anything humorous, you know, that's one characteristic of Indian people that I grew up, you know, that's what helped keep us going. But, you know, I always gave the example, okay, the teepee, and, you know, the guy's getting ready to go to council, and his wife is telling me, okay, now when you go to council, this is what you say, and this is what you're going to do. So she goes, yeah, and he goes to council, and, you know, they make a decision, but that's probably happening in all the other camps as well. So in a way, I've always said, if it was not for the women, we would not even be where we are today because of their resilience and their strength to bring us through those reservation times, the boarding school times. And even now, the Federal Indian Relocation Act, I hear stories of the women being the ones stepping up and getting the jobs in the urban areas, or the ones stepping up to try to get their children in school to, have a positive outcome in their situation. So I kind of veered off a little bit, but I think that critical race theory is very much prevalent now, especially with American Indian people.
Very, very so. I love that you highlighted the role and strength and power of women. We have 3 women on the panel here. And I just wanted to share a story from my own family, 2 generations of boarding school as well. Our family went to the Carlisle Indian Boarding School, the original boarding school out in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And my uncle was, I guess they called him a rascal or incorrigible at the time. And he ran away several times and was severely punished. They had posses back then to round up the kids who ran away from school. And it was just a miserable, miserable time for him. My aunt was also at Carlisle, and she was a model student. She learned to cook and sew, and she learned to read and write, and she brought it back to the reservation and really made something of herself. She became the first and only woman chief of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. And the 2 married and had children. And my uncle just had a very, very hard time, very much struggled, where she took that and was a very strong, resilient woman leader. But there's a cost to that as well. And it was the poverty and the relocation, as you said, Rick, and such. One of our audience participants also mentioned the book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, Vine Deloria. And folks are wondering, could we provide some resources, some other titles of books and resources? And maybe, Lucy, we could pull this together and add this to the program at the end. So big thumbs up there. Good, good, good. And then another participant, so I'm really appreciating this engagement, is next month's anniversary of the Sand Creek Massacre. And Ava, I'm just really still absorbing the fact that your family was your relatives were part of the massacre, and White Antelope was one of the first to die. And there will be events connected to that. How do you feel about the reviving this? For us, it's like the battle at Wounded Knee, and it's something that we remark, not to celebrate, but again, maybe our resilience and survivability of all this.
Well, it's a real political kind of topic with Northern and Southern Cheyennes, Northern and Southern Arapahoes, because there's a committee, DU has a committee, and I went there for the inauguration of the new chancellor, and they were having a meeting, so there were representatives from Montana and Wyoming and Oklahoma, and I asked to attend the meeting. They wouldn't let me because I was not an official representative, which to me, it means that these official representatives are tribal employees. I mean, I don't know if that's how it is, but so I didn't get to go to the meeting. But those are all of our relatives. We have relatives in all of the Northern, Southern, and Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, and yet it's like a colonized kind of approach, if you're not official, you can't attend this meeting. But I thought they might want to hear about things that we're doing here in Colorado, which is now all of our homeland, We didn't stop in the 1800s. Nothing stopped, Our lives moved on. We had to adjust to many, many difficulties of survival. And but we continue to move, and now we have a lot of tribes here, and we're not stopped. The 1800s did not stop us. We're still in motion. So we're doing a lot of things like that were mentioned. I think Gracie, the land back, and some of that is in Colorado. But we want land, and so we want it for the urban community. We've formed a nonprofit that's called People of the Sacred Land, to take in land as a nonprofit for the use of all tribes who live here and want access. But there are some tribes that want some land, but I think it would be just specifically for that tribe who doesn't live here. I mean, I'm talking about the Arapahoes, or North and South, or the Cheyennes in Montana and Oklahoma. So we're not in competition with the tribes that we're members of at all, but the legalities of it, it's part of our forward motion of how we're changing. We're including people from many tribes while remaining loyal and active with our own people, our own tribes. So it's a change. It's something that's going on. But for that, like when they were the changing of the dorm name to Cheyenne and Arapahoe Hall, I was told to really not to participate by one of my elders, my Cheyenne elders in Denver. He said, "Don't disturb our dead people." So I thought it was, I mean, when I first came, I learned about the initiative to change White Antelope Hall. So I just stepped back because I just wanted to be respectful of my elder. But with this new initiative with Sand Creek, the Northern Cheyennes asked me to document as a filmmaker the first run. So I went all the way and I documented other runs. Once we ran from Sand Creek to Ethity, Wyoming. So I've been on those runs. Part of the people recognizing my, I didn't step out and get recognition for documenting that. I think they like that. Mm-hmm. And so all of my my indigenous knowledge that I have for different tribes, I have not stepped out and I have not revealed what I learned. And so I think that that makes it easier for me to get more knowledge. Mm. So that's what I do. But with the COVID, it's like a massacre. A lot of our knowledge holders have, a lot of our tribes have been impacted by the death of our knowledge holders. And so there's people like me who have knowledge from different tribes, but I'm not entitled to, I don't have the responsibility. I have not earned the responsibility to have some of this indigenous knowledge, which is ceremonial. I'm talking about the ceremonial part. Historically, I can access and get information. And that's one of the things that I'm working on right now is to, because I really want us to have our knowledges and not just have it be indigenous knowledge. I want our tribes to have these stories because they're not stories, they're lessons. They're learning and teaching lessons about our relationship to things, to life, things in life. And it's really important that that continues to exist. So one of the things that I'm starting to discuss with other historians like myself who are not academically trained but who are oral historians is to seek out and to protect our knowledge holders, because there's plenty of support for academic education, but writing a PhD paper and taking a class is not the same at all. It's nothing like that. These knowledge holders, if we don't protect them in the same way that we're supposed to, that we have been for thousands of years, those knowledges could go away. And it scares me.
Oh, yes.
And
It should scare all of us, the
Yeah.
language, the culture, the ceremonies
Yeah.
and so forth.
it has to do with critical thinking.
And it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about that. This is such a good conversation. We only have about, less than 15 minutes left. So I wanted to think about, and we're all activists here in different ways. We're bringing a lot of energy and focus to our Indigenous communities, our work and so forth. One of the people in the audience has asked, how can we collectively as Boulder, the city of Boulder, the county of Boulder, the university community, how can the audience support these efforts to help Boulder take better next steps? We had a earlier question about the homelessness in Boulder and the prevalence of Indigenous people among the unhoused or unhomed, I should say. So what is your recommendation, Rick? What is your picture for the future? What do you want people to do?
First of all, the last question was about, any kind of books or anything like that. Because we're in Boulder, because we're in Colorado, now she is not Indian, but Margaret Cole, last name Coel, is an author that has a book that's been even endorsed by Rick Williams, but it gives a very accurate, realistic, and probably hard truth to Coloradans about what happened around Sand Creek and leading up, but it's called Chief Left Hand. But Margaret Cole, that's a book that she did a lot of research on, lived with the Arapahoes, lived with the CNAs in Oklahoma. And she actually was a novelist. That's what kind of got her started there, but she got so interested, I believe, that she went into and wrote this very informative book, Chief Left Hand. Here in Boulder, I just learned, the more opportunities you have, and I don't know if you picked up anything tonight or not, but the more opportunities you have to learn about the history of Boulder, and there's so much. For example, I just learned just a couple of weeks ago, there was a fort here, a sod fort, Fort Chambers, that was actually a staging or a training fort for militia to prepare for Sand Creek. And it was over on J Road and 63rd over in that area. But the Open Space Board in Boulder is now working with a group called Right Relationship Boulder, which is looking at trying to work with the tribes, particularly the Cheyenne Arapaho, to see what they can do with that land. Wow. In terms of, talking about giving land back. But that's a suggestion I have. But it's read, take every opportunity to attend events, not necessarily powwows always, but educational events around history, because there's so much you can learn about what really happened here in Colorado. Think about it. Over in Louisville, just a little ways from here, there are coal mines. Okay, what did coal do back then? It supplied energy to the industry that was building in Denver. Right. But when you really do the critical thinking and investigation, a lot of those industries were illegal because it was still reservation land. Mm-hmm. And they were powering locomotives to bring in troops and to combat. And, that was a part of the Indian War. So that's understanding the history of where you're at will help you understand when we talk about, when we have protests around naming of landmarks and or mascot issue and things like that, but it wasn't mentioned, well, you mentioned it earlier, Colorado was the 5th state to ban mascots, but I'll stop right there.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the recommendation. And and for Chambers, the connection of Boulder to the Sand Creek Massacre is something probably many, many people do not recognize or realize, what have you. Grace, I'm going to go back to you and, what are your recommendations, your thought for forward action? Pay it forward sort of thing.
I think I agree with everything that Rick has mentioned and Ava and yourself. And I think that really shifting perspectives and understanding that, just like Lucy said with the land acknowledgement when she first started, everywhere you go, this is Indian land that has been stolen. We are on this is occupied land by invaders. And land back is what we want. And Ava mentioned, Talbot Memorial Park. That is our land. That's a space for us that was negotiated by Richard Talbot and with the city of Denver, with Wellington Webb, when Wellington Webb was the mayor. So we do have that. And you mentioned the anniversary of Sand Creek Massacre coming up. We have a place that's near downtown Denver. It's called Four Winds American Indian Council. And that was a property. It was a property that was owned by the Lutheran Synod. And there's a house that's next door to it. And the Lutheran Synod was so moved by the 150th anniversary of the Sand Creek Massacre that they deeded that land back to the Indian community in Denver. And so let's do things like that. Let's deed some land back to the rightful owners. That's what I would like to see. And I'm a grandmother. I would love to see my grandchildren grow up and things like this are happening. And they're feeling hopeful that this land will be ours again. I would love to see that for our future, for my grandchildren's grandchildren. I would love to see that. And I talk about this a lot. I talk about what I would love to see in the future. And I ask young people what they would love to see in the future. And these are the things that they talk about too. But they also have fears.
Yes.
They also have fears and they have stresses. And some of our young people, they don't think that they're going to live to be old people. And that's a prayer that our people have. We pray for our little children that they will live long lives, that they will grow old. And some of our young people, they don't believe that because of what's happening in our world. So that's what I would like to see, and that's what I would like to share.
Oh, thank you, Grace. So Ava, you have about 3 minutes for your
Well,
your
my
vision.
thing is it okay?
Yes.
My concern is Mother Earth. First and foremost, I think that we should all work together to make a change away from fossil fuels and love and respect all life, including each other. And because if we don't have life, nothing will be here. History won't matter, education won't matter, capitalism won't matter. Nothing, because there will be no life. Our world is dying. Our mother is dying and needs our help. That would be my priority. But on another level, it's, let's work together. Let's be good people to each other and make a better world than our history.
I love that. That's a beautiful way to end. And just let me add something from our Lakota spiritual leader, Sitting Bull, who said, let us put our heads together and see what world we can make for our children. So with that, it's been a tremendous honor, Grace and Ava and Rick, to spend this time with you this evening. I've learned a lot, and I've had so many more questions that we could go on for a little while more, but some very profound things have been said here tonight, and I'm just grateful for all of you. Thank you so much. Wopilatanka.